Hi everybody, this is Matthew Poes with Poes Acoustics, and in this video by John Oz, 3 weeks ago, it's not 3 weeks ago anymore, sorry. He gave me a $25 donation, so thank you very much, that's very generous, and he said, thanks, I have an Emotiva Bass X 3-channel amp for my LCR. His speakers he lists are the Klipsch RP600 Mark IIs, two of those, and an RP504C2, I assume that's the center channel. But I'm curious about the difference in other power amps. Is it true that someone like me with relatively simple speakers wouldn't experience a difference with something like a Buckeye Purify Hypex-based amp? Right now, I have plenty of power, but I'm mainly curious about the control people talk about with higher-end amps. Would you think the Emotiva Bass X is lacking in that department, even though it is otherwise good enough for my use case? So I'm not going to talk about specific products because I think that's tricky, and I'm going to talk about this in more general terms. I'm first going to say the simple answer to your question is I cannot answer your question. I don't know the answer to that. And I don't think anybody actually could give you a legitimate answer to that. So many people who watch my channel probably are familiar with the fact that there's been a lot of controversy dating back to probably the 50s or 60s, where it had been noted that under most circumstances, amplifiers could achieve a certain degree of perfection, we'll say, whereby all amplifiers would sound the same. And then others have argued that that's not really true, and amplifiers all impart their own color and distortion and you name it, and so you really have to find those good amplifiers, but that every amplifier sounds different and some are better than others, something like that, right? And so here's the issue. Realistically, a proper amplifier doesn't have a sound. If the amplifier has any kind of sound to it, it's coloring things, and those are distortions, and those are not good. So what are the likely distortions the amplifier would have? Well, it could change the shape of the frequency response. That is like a most basic thing you don't want it to do, but most tube amplifiers, for instance, change the shape of the frequency response. It's just an unfortunate part of those amplifiers because of their age and the design that's used for those, and the fact that most of them use output transformers. They end up not having a flat frequency response when given a dynamic load like a speaker. So those often have rolled off highs, somewhat emphasized bass. They also tend to have very, very high even order distortion compared to most modern, we'll call them feedback solid-state amplifier designs. I'm going to say high because some aren't that high. Like this Bass X is a feedback design. It's not a particularly high feedback design. So the high even order distortion actually has a certain benefit. It tends to add a kind of warmth. It's pleasant sounding, and a lot of people actually like the way that makes music. It's imparting a positive distortion. It's still a distortion, and we still arguably don't want it, but it's a more positive distortion. Some of the old amplifiers that had very limited bandwidth, high feedback designs tended to have very high, so what they were very good at was canceling out that even order and actually low order distortion. But they tended to cause higher odd order distortion, and especially higher order. And the higher order it is, the more audible and detrimental it is, and odd order tends to sound worse than even order. So when you take all that together, those amps tended to have what a lot of people felt was like a shoutiness or a hardness. Now, over the years, there's been numerous tests that people have tried to do. Some have claimed double-blind tests that proved amplifiers sound different, and others have claimed double-blind tests in which nobody could tell a difference. I will say that I think we've probably been in a state where for at least the last 10 years, if not more, under most circumstances, good amplifiers, I'm not going to say all, but good amplifiers sound the same. When it comes to things like distortion and noise and, I shouldn't say that, hold on, I'm going to take that one back. Distortion and frequency response. Where I have found there to be the biggest differences between amplifiers, which is why I still like a good amplifier, has been actually in other areas. So one of them is noise. Amplifiers can have relatively good signal-to-noise ratios. And so you would look at that number, 100 dB, 120 dB, 140 dB. 140 is actually really good. Probably that would not be a problem. But we'll say 120, because I've seen products that are as high as that still have hiss. When they're connected, so let's just say this amplifier has 120 dB signal-to-noise ratio, but it's got 31 dB of input gain, and it's connected to speakers that have like 101 dB at 1 watt, 1 meter, or we'll say 2.83 volts at 1 meter sensitivity, right? So this is a high sensitivity speaker. That's going to be amplifying hiss because it's going to be, if you think about it, when you have a really high sensitivity speaker, what it's doing is it's actually using the lowest power range of the amplifier most of the time. and the lowest power range of the amplifier tends to be dominated by noise. So that's not a great thing to have. So it's one of the negatives of efficient speakers is that you end up with the noisier part of the spectrum. There are fixes to that, and one of them actually is to pad down the tweeter and make the speaker a bit less sensitive, especially the tweeter specifically. And then that way, even though, yes, you're losing some sensitivity because of the padding resistors, you're forcing the amplifier into a less noisy range. So that's a trick that's not uncommon. That's issue number one. The other issue is that if the amplifier doesn't have, have enough power, and that's not a completely unheard of thing, then the amplifier may clip. And if the amplifier clips, that's pretty bad sounding too. So my experience has been that it is not all that hard to create a scenario whereby the speaker does clip the amplifier and that you may need more power than you realize. So there's a bunch of things said here for which I cannot say are true or not. He says that there's enough amplifier power here, power is not an issue. That could be true, that may not be true. It's hard for me to answer that. He's asking also whether Buckeye Purify Hypex amps sound better or not. What I can say is that I think that it's important to make sure that in your scenario, the amplifier you've chosen has a good gain match to your processor. I'm going to guess this is connected to a receiver. If it is connected to a receiver, it's going to have a lower voltage output than a processor would have, especially a balanced one. And so probably the match is correct, and the noise is close to, if not as good as it can be, under the circumstances. That's not always true in every system I've worked on, but I'm going to guess in this scenario it is. I've worked on some situations specifically with Denon receivers, actually, not picking on them. It's just actually that the Denon receivers measured really well, and they had tested quite well on some forums. They basically equaled or bettered some of the really high-end processors on the market. So people were buying them because in their mind, that meant they were just as good as like a high-end processor would be. They then connected them to something like a really good Hypex-based amplifier. And the end result, when I had come in to tune it, was actually that there was a lot of hiss. That was one of the problems. There was hum in a bunch of the systems. And all of this just stems from, in the cases where I was dealing with this, overcomplicated designs using equipment that was technically good, but not a good match to each other. It's a common issue you run into. It's one of the reasons why it's nice to be able to stick with, not always, if you know how to match, you can do it in other ways, but in many cases, if you buy a Marantz processor, for instance, like the AV10, and you buy I think it's called the Amp 10, something like that, the 16-channel amp they have, they're a good match for each other, and you're probably pretty assured you're not going to have any issues with it. In the examples I've had where you've got like all sorts of different amplifiers, sometimes even from the same manufacturer, but there's different modules being used for the front speakers versus the side and back, and they have different gain, and you get it all connected, and all of a sudden it's a mess. The worst of which was one like that where there also were, I think, 3 mini DSPs in there that were being used for the subwoofers. They were actually chained, so 2 of them came off the 2 sub-outs, and then there was another one chained off of one of them, and there was just terrible hum, terrible hiss. A lot of it was unfixable. Did our best to get it best we could, but ultimately the best solution for this particular setup would have been if we had just gotten rid of that receiver and throw in a processor, actually would have fixed it. Okay. So another piece of the question here is, do these lowly Klipsch RP600 Mark IIs sound so poor that you can't resolve the difference in a good amplifier? And I would say that to me is kind of silly. I mean, it is possible that the distortion, for instance, of that speaker is higher than a high-end speaker, but I would guess that it's low enough that if there were some issues that were audible in the amplifier, you'd still resolve it. Hiss, for sure. In fact, that's probably a relatively sensitive speaker, and so it'd be more likely to make hiss audible, which could make a better amplifier a bigger benefit. And then you get this other thing, this control idea. I remember reading, Sean Olive had commented something on a forum because he likes to stir the pot once in a while, and he said something like, what is this word resolution? I don't know what this means. There's no definition for it. And he was making the point that while if I said to you, what does it mean that a system is resolving? You could give me an answer. There is no technical definition. It's not a technical term. It doesn't actually mean anything in audio engineering. It's a made-up term that's used to describe something that probably encompasses multiple measurable factors, but in and of itself isn't. And control is the same thing. It doesn't really have a meaning. It's not a technical term. You could break it into a set of technical terms, but in and of itself, everybody who uses that probably means either something different or a series of somethings together. So what do I think is meant by that? they probably are referring to the way that the amplifier is able to control the movement of the speaker, right? Well, in general, if an amplifier could not control the movement of the speaker well, and it was introducing some sort of a distortion as a result of that, it would in fact be measurable as distortion. Now, there are some things like damping factor, which are related to that, but many of these amplifiers have pretty high damping factor, enough so that based on the research that's been done, it's relatively unlikely that moving to an amplifier with higher damping factor would make much of a difference, especially in living rooms. I mean, I'll just say this. If you have at least 14 gauge, maybe even 12 gauge wire going to your speakers, it's in a living room and the amplifier is next to the speakers, meaning it's within, we'll say 12 feet, and your runs are under 20 feet, I would guess that the Emotiva, which is not a super high damping factor amplifier, would still have more than enough to be audibly indistinguishable from the Hypex or the Purify, which is an extremely high damping factor amplifier. And so I don't think you'd be able to hear a difference in control because of that. I don't think anybody can. I think that that would be a made-up concept. Realistically, where these better amplifiers often come into play is going to be the lower noise and distortion, which any speaker should be able to resolve if it matters. But in many cases, those amplifiers actually have as low or lower noise and distortion than the receiver or processor powering them, at least for these really good amps, I'm saying, not necessarily all of them. And the bigger thing you're really after is power. So if the amplifier you have has enough power, increasing the amplifier to something with more power isn't necessarily going to give you any benefit. Because if you already were never turning it up loud enough to push the amp to its limits and clip it, you're not going to do that with the more power. It's not like going to the better amplifier is going to change that factor. So I think my answer to you is basically, I don't know. You'd have to buy one and try for yourself. But my take has generally been that amplifiers don't sound wildly different from each other. And that the main reason why I like better amplifiers actually has to do with the ability to make sure they're a good match to the processor I'm using, that they have enough power for my needs, and that the noise and distortion is all low enough that there's no chance that after that input gain, I'm running into problems. In fact, the input gain is often the thing I pay the most attention to. I either want it to be adjustable or I want it to be a good match to the processor I'm using. And my preference is to have high voltage processors like Trinnovs and Storms, which happen to be higher voltage processors. But you know what? The Anthem AVM90 and the Marantz AV10 both have very strong outputs too. All of those, in my opinion, are good enough that when used with a lower gain amplifier will have lower noise. And so that's like how I look at that. It's more of a system design approach. I'm not really all that interested in things like whether brand A sounds better than brand B for an amplifier, because in my experience, they all kind of sound the same. And I've had lots of people tell me that must mean that my ears are broken and I shouldn't even be doing this because how can I not hear a difference? But I got to tell you, there's a counter argument to that, which is that my ears are not broken. They test fine. I don't have any notable hearing loss for somebody my age. And I have heard hundreds and hundreds of amplifiers. I've even designed and built amplifiers and played around with the circuits and the parts and adjusted the way that they behave by doing that. And I just don't, I mean, they get to a certain point, which most amplifiers are already at nowadays, that I don't really hear a difference. Really, really junky Class D amplifiers, like the ones that are using those little, I call them pocket amps, the little tiny ones. They typically use monolithic Class D chips, and they have really lousy output filter designs, high distortion, very reactive. Yeah, those sound worse than other amplifiers. But once we get into like a reasonable amplifier design, I tend to find they all typically sound about the same. And the areas where I find things to be most notably different is actually noise. And that's the thing that bugs me, because when I'm building a room like this one, where my noise floor is extremely low, I don't want the equipment to ever be the noise you hear. I would much rather the noise you hear in the room. Obviously, I want it to be the content, but like when nothing's playing at all and there's just noise in the room, the loudest thing I want you to hear is the HVAC system, which I'm already going to try to reduce down to next to nothing. I don't want you to hear hiss from the speakers. I don't want you to hear hum from amplifiers or speakers that are humming, like subwoofers that have ground loops. I don't ever want that to be what dominates the noise floor of the room. I want it to be some sort of just like really low level white noise. All right, so that is what I have to say on that one. Like and subscribe on my channel, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and you'll have more videos like this coming your way. I've got new content coming on other topics that I haven't covered before, so I think you'll find that interesting. The super thanks, is that what it's called, that you guys have been doing are great. I really appreciate that. I've had a lot of people push me to put together a Patreon page as maybe a better way to do this. And I think if we did that as part of campaigns in order to raise funds for certain tasks or as a way to generally support the channel, it's not a bad idea. I've never done that before, so I will let you know if I decide to go that route. But for now, we're keeping it this way. It's all working. I really appreciate all the support from everybody. Keep on watching. I got more videos coming. Thanks, guys.